really lovely to be back here a couple of years after my PhD as a theoretically, potentially distinguished person. I don't know, that seems a bit of a stretch, but I'll take it. And, to see, so many people that were so, influential in sort of my, development and growth as a researcher, not least, of course, Cliff Sarin, who came here from Marin, one of my two PhD supervisors. The other one, Susan Rivera, is on the East Coast, so she gets a pass. Of course, I also pay my respects to the Putwin and Miwok and Nisenan and Maidu peoples who, have cared for and stewarded these lands since time immemorial. Thank you all for being here. I see, clearly, this transition to adulthood issue is such an important and pressing topic in our communities. So we have already heard actually from Laura the first thing that I was going to mention, which is, of course, that many autistic people are struggling in post-secondary, less likely to succeed in post-secondary. One other thing that really struck me when I was reading this report coming out of Drexel University, actually, was that there's a huge whopping difference as well between whether autistic people attend post-secondary or not, based on whether they had a parent who attended post-secondary education or not. I think it's like 14% of autistic people who did not have a parent who attended post-secondary will go on to attend post-secondary, compared to like 45% or so who did. So really a threefold gap there, and based on what I was able to find from general population US data, a much bigger and very troubling gap. So clearly there's not only inequities, in autism, but they're disproportionately affecting people who don't have, families who already, understand these systems and are able to, provide that support to help people navigate those systems, visualize themselves in those systems and navigate them successfully. So how do we make campuses, that's the focus here, inclusion specifically in, post-secondary campuses, especially university, not, inclusive education more broadly. How, can we make those campuses inclusive? So actually there is a research network that I'm somewhat slightly involved in Canada. I'm from Canada, I'm Canadian, that is focused on, campus belonging for autistic students. This is led by Heather Brown, who's another one of those people in the sort of special group of autism researchers. And moreover, we are also collaborating with autistic people in the community. So we're not just getting the autistic researcher perspective, but also autistic people in the community and what they think we need to be doing for this project. And so part of that, which is work that's spearheaded by Hannah, whose picture you see there, is qualitative research, asking autistic students about when they are belonging on campus and when they are not belonging on campus and why, and trying to figure out the factors of that. So won't go through that entire, graph now. We'll circle back to some of the other points a bit later, but you can see, on the bottom there, you've got the point about faculty and staff relations. In the green there, faculty and staff who are understanding, who can make things accessible and inclusive, and including whether there's staff who are openly neurodivergent on campus, people who can model and support neurodiversity inclusion, and who could be like a role model for students to say like, oh yeah, it's okay to be neurodivergent here in the academy. There are people who are doing that and being successful, and also peer relations. People, wanting to have spaces where, they can, be free to unmask, free to be their authentic selves, with their peers, and social connectedness, which for some people might be with non-autistic, neurotypical people, but for others it may be with other neurodivergent people in communities. Not only because we need the social connection, but also for like networking and learning information. All of these things being very important to succeeding on campus. So actually, while I was doing my PhD here, I was one of the people who founded this community that still exists today, that I will tell you a bit about, the Aggie Neurodiversity community at UC Davis. So when I first arrived at UC Davis, there was not actually a community for autistic or neurodivergent students. Now, I later learned, I think maybe through Marjorie, that there was one previously a few years before I arrived, but as often is the case with these sort of student-led initiatives, key leaders left and things stopped happening. On that note, there was a disability rights advocacy committee. It's now called something else through the student union, and that too lost some key people just as I was arriving and was sort of on hiatus for a while. So in this gap, myself and two other autistic students stepped in. We founded this originally an autism and neurodiversity community, and subsequently, that was renamed the Aggie Neurodiversity community to be more inclusive of neurodivergence more broadly, in order to create this space where people can have that connectedness, can be free to, unmask and be their authentic selves and be accepted as such. So first and foremost, our purpose, has always been that we are a peer support community. We exist to provide that space. But, realizing, the extent of the issues that are on campuses, our members, were feeling like we need to do something more as well. And this was not coming from me. I want to make that very clear. This was happening actually at a meeting in late 2019. This meeting happened, and I had actually stepped outside into the hallway, because there was somebody who was in a bit of distress, and the meeting continued without me. And when I came back, people had decided that the problem of lack of understanding of autism and neurodiversity on campus was sufficiently large that we needed to do something about it, and people were committed to doing that. And I was like, great, let's do that. And this actually, circles back to Hannah's work as well, because you can see right there in the other, factor of this belongingness on campus that I didn't tell you about, it's the university support and acceptance. And a part of that was whether the institution is making efforts to promote understanding of autism. So since that wasn't really happening at the scale that we needed, certainly, we were like, okay, well, we'll do that. And so we got together, a subgroup of us. We didn't want to compromise the core peer support purpose of the organization. We didn't want to make neurodivergent students feel that they couldn't be part of this peer support community unless they were, spending their time on this as well. Of course, people are already struggling, may not have the spoons, the capacity to do so. So we created this separate advocacy group to do those things, behind the scenes. People could join if they wanted, but we're under no pressure to do so. And that was with some of our own members, as well as, allies who are not part of our group. And we developed, I think, a really neat customized approach. So we had certain core, things focused on autism and ADHD in particular, because we have to have a limit to what we can cover in a certain amount of time. But then in addition to that sort of core content that would be relatively similar for everything, each time some new, office or department or center would come to us and seek information, we would put our heads together and come up with some points that are really specifically geared towards that center, towards what they're doing, towards the sort of interactions they're likely to have with neurodivergent people, and some recommendations for what they could do better. And very often, people were so surprised by some of the things that we were presenting, because it was just not on the radar, that they would be really interested. And often we would then get a referral from somebody we were training in the last group to say, oh, well, I'm also involved with these other people. Why don't you come along there as well? So this grassroots initiative just sort of kept, growing and growing, and also very helpfully, it was no longer explicitly, exclusively volunteer time. Actually, the Center for Excellence in Developmental Disability right here, as well as the Student Disability Center, gave us a bit of support so that people were getting a bit of remuneration for the time that they were, putting into this. And so actually one of the referrals that we were getting just from somebody who listened to the training, Javier Arswag, I believe, was connected to the University California-wide Senate and its Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee back in times when those sorts of things still existed. And that led to an invitation for us to, present to them. We actually drafted up some recommendations on neurodiversity, which were subsequently endorsed and approved by the academic senate. I want to be clear what that means. These are not binding orders. These are recommendations. They have not all or even necessarily mostly been implemented. There remain quite a few gaps. So there is this institutional support that these are things that people would like to happen. But I want to be clear that, I'm not saying that these recommendations have been implemented. This is giving maybe some more backing, some more support, so that hopefully they will be at some point if we keep advocating collectively for them. But that does not mean that they are in place right now. And you can see as well, we published these recommendations so that they're available beyond the UC as well. So those of us who are very involved in the training at the time, myself, Erica Mineo, and Kristen Mifsud, who were students at UC Davis at the time, Chris Lindholm, a parent ally, Ava Gerba, who's from another institution, and T.C. Weisman, who published recommendations similarly to this that I sort of stole some information from. Our recommendations, briefly, included establishing disability cultural centers on campus because, a student disability center is great for providing accommodations and things, but that sets up a certain dynamic, and, we also need spaces for, things like the Aggie neurodiversity community where you can have that belongingness and that space, that refuge area where you can be your authentic self. Recommendation 2, again, politics have changed since then, but we were saying it should be recognized as a diversity, equity, and inclusion issue. We were saying we need campus-wide neurodiversity training, so scaling up what we were trying to do and making it more global. Ensuring, of course, that neurodivergent people are involved in leaders in neurodiversity initiatives. Trying to really integrate disability accommodations, which sometimes are a little spread out or hard to find, or they're hard to get, especially quickly in a crisis when you need them, or maybe the kind of accommodations on offer aren't exactly what you need. So trying to really streamline that and make that a very easy process to navigate, because the last thing that you want is for the process of getting accommodations to, actually be so difficult that it kind of is not really worth the effort required. That is not a great thing. And also, including as, necessary accommodations, the sensory issues, because, the range of sort of academic focused accommodations and so on often just doesn't recognize those as legitimate. And sometimes there's very simple things that a campus community can actually do as a whole to remove these. Like, for example, we've been, applauding with our hands throughout this symposium so far, but actually one simple thing, if there's anyone in here who's bothered by that, we can avoid that by doing this instead with our hands. I'll invite you to consider doing that in the future. Would definitely encourage you to do that in the future, just in case there is somebody who's bothered by that here. I'm slightly bothered. I can live with it, though. And of course, I won't belabor, recommendation 8, which I feel like Laura's, more than amply justified, as well as showing how this can be done very well. That, if you've got people, who have been going through, high school with a lot of, structure put in place for them to an even greater extent than in the neurotypical population. Suddenly we're pulling people into a new environment, totally unfamiliar, and expecting them to suddenly invent for themselves all of these skills that have always been done for them before. This is not a recipe for success. we need some supports to make that a smoother process, as well as supports for a smooth transition out. Because, again, Laura, you were sharing that example of somebody with a very advanced degree, very underemployed. We need supports so that people can take this education that they have, successfully gotten, hopefully, and then go on to their next goal from that. Also mental health supports, because of course, the mental health supports that we have, they may not be understanding or suitable for, neurodivergent students or understanding of neurodivergent students' needs. If there are, disputes about accommodations, mechanisms to resolve that, having some flexibility in how people can connect with offices, in terms of what modalities to use, whether or not they have a support person, and trying to sort of generalize that so that people don't have to go through the same process every time they go to a new office on campus. So again, I'm not saying that all of this is in place. It would be lovely if all of this was in place, but these are things that, we are starting to get some buy-in for, hopefully, and, hopefully that can make them more widely available. Now, I mentioned before at the very beginning the issue of student initiatives and their survivability over the long term. So I was really worried as I was getting closer and closer to finishing my Ph.D. that Aggie neurodiversity community would not survive. Fortunately, my fears were greatly exaggerated because the wonderful Natalie or Nix Moriarty, who is a graduate student in the psychology program, much like I was, came forward and said that she was going to take over. She volunteered to do so and, was affirmed by the group to do so and, brought a tremendous, enthusiasm and passion and really actually re-energized the Aggie neurodiversity community, started new things, exciting new initiatives, and it reinvigorated the community. And now Natalie is, coming to the end of her period, leading the club, but everything is set up for another, smooth transition to, Aaron Burnett and Kate Deem and others taking over the group. So, many thanks to all of those people who have been carrying this forward and bringing it to new heights. For example, there's now a disability graduation ceremony in partnership with the Disabled Students Union, which, I had absolutely nothing to do with. Probably would never have occurred to me, but wonderful initiative. There's now over 250 members of the group. They're having weekly meetings and special events. The new leadership, is advocating for on-campus sensory rooms, for example. So lots of exciting things happening, and if you have any interest in a neurodivergent community for students, and you are a student or know a student, there's their contact information. But that final point there about, the sensory-friendly room, that intersects with the second thing I was going to talk to you about, which is the sensory piece. So getting back to Hannah's qualitative study here, the other question, another key factor of belonging is whether the environment on campus meets sensory needs. And actually from this same campus belongingness study, there is a survey. And so what we're seeing here is that, the students who have the highest belonging on campus in the autistic population, they're the ones with the less sensory hyperresponsiveness issues. The more of these sensory issues you have, the less belongingness, which makes sense because if you are just trying to survive in the space that's distressing and uncomfortable, then how on earth are you going to feel that you're going to belong in that environment or have the energy to be successful? So that is work that Annie Wong has done. And this is a bit of an issue because a lot of the research that we've been doing, and I myself am very guilty of this, as Marjorie was saying, most of my sensory research is dedicated to understanding the autistic sensory differences and how those might be related to attention and things like that. Very little sensory research has actually focused on sensory environments, on making our sensory environments more accessible and inclusive, which is the thing that we actually need to do in order to address the sensory issues. So one small thing that we have been doing in my new research at La Trobe in Australia towards trying to address this is actually taking an experience sampling approach towards trying to understand these sensory issues. So what do I mean by experience sampling? Well, there's various different terms for it, but basically what we're talking about is we have this wonderful technology, the smartphone, and one of the things that this can do is actually give people prompts to provide information about what is going on in their experiences in their everyday lived environments. So not coming into a survey that's completely separated from the real world environments you live in. No, you're going through your day-to-day life and you're filling out these questions as you do, providing information on your day-to-day life. That is somewhat tricky when it comes to sensory experiences because, for example, maybe the sensory experience is very brief and you're very overwhelmed during it and you can't actually answer questions about it at that time. So we did want to actually co-design this with autistic people who are not researchers and who could tell us, what's a reasonable way to do this that is not overly burdensome and will actually sort of capture what we're trying to get. So some students at La Trobe partnered with us in this, and we eventually hit on the solution that we will ask people to fill out these questions several times a day. They will have an hour to fill it out, so it doesn't have to be straight away, and they're reporting on the previous 2 hours. So even if it's a very brief sensory experience, they can still say something about it. So whenever they fill these questions out, they're providing a rating of their sensory comfort, anxiety, irritability, and exhaustion within that period. And they're also answering some open-ended questions, telling us, where they were, what they were doing, what's the sensory environment around them in that time. And in the end, 19 students filled out between 8 and 30 surveys each. I think the average was something like 18 surveys per person or something in that range. And so what did we find? So here we're definitely seeing that the more sensory comfort, you're seeing the less anxiety, the less irritability, or to put that another way, the more sensory discomfort, the more irritability, the more anxiety. And also there was a smaller effect with exhaustion, but not statistically reliable when accounting for irritability and anxiety, as well as, what time of day, in case, people are more exhausted at certain times of day and things like that. So this is really showing, we don't know for sure the causal directionality of this, but it definitely seems likely that, the sensory experiences could be contributing a fair bit to this, and that actually when you're going through life feeling this sort of sensory distress, that can actually potentially be causing a lot of anxiety, a lot of emotional reactivity that can really interfere perhaps with your ability to be successful as a student on campus. The other thing here is we can actually see this association within individuals as well. So each of these, different lines here, that's one person, and so you can see even within the individuals, when they are reporting more sensory discomfort for that individual, that they're reporting more anxiety, more irritability and emotional reactivity, for that individual in that time when they are experiencing the sensory discomfort. So it could well be bidirectional, but we know from some prior research that there's reason to believe that sensory discomfort influences anxiety, and maybe if we had more data, we'd be able to parse out the directionality of those effects, but we don't have enough power at this point. But I do think it's likely that this is showing some causal influence, but I can't prove it. The other thing that we have here are we have these open-ended responses where people are telling us about what they're doing. So we did a content analysis on this. We here meaning myself and Laura Broadbent, who is a clinical master's student in psychology at La Trobe. We're just doing that so that we could see, what sorts of sensory stimuli, what sorts of sensory environments are associated with these distressing experiences. Not necessarily, expecting to find anything particularly astonishing, but just hoping to actually get some quantitative numbers behind a lot of the things that many of us could probably already guess. So for example, here you can see in the red, this is people's sensory comfort at home. Further they are to the right on this graph, the more sensory comfort. The further they are to the left, the less sensory comfort, the more sensory discomfort. And the blue here is on campus. So you can see at home, Sometimes people are experiencing sensory discomfort, which is not great. A lot of the time they seem more sensory comfortable, though, but on campus that's reversed. You know, a lot of the time people are actually experiencing sensory discomfort on campus, to the point that, you know, actually their most common state is, you know, some level of sensory discomfort. And then you're trying to study and be successful as a student in that environment where so much of your, you know, energy is coping with sensory discomfort. This is actually not super easy. This is a challenge. This is an unnecessary additional challenge that is probably contributing to some of the, you know, poorer outcomes of post-secondary education for autistic students. So, you know, we can continue and go through and see, you know, other sorts of things here. For example, sometimes, you know, people are explicitly describing what kind of sensory reaction they're having. Now, we didn't actually ask that. We asked about their sensory environment, not the sensory reaction they had to that environment, but a lot of the time people volunteered that information even though we didn't ask for it. And people often talked about negative sensory experiences. Sorry, it says 40% there. It should say 35% there. Still, you know, quite a lot of the time people were talking about negative experiences, uncomfortable experiences, you know, annoying experiences, frustrating, irritating experiences, distracting experiences, stopping people from focusing. So this is not great. We also see a lot of the time, you know, people are exposed to high intensity stimulation, you know, loud environments, busy environments, bright environments, and people are not enjoying those environments. You know, complex, busy environments, particularly associated with sensory discomfort, lower levels of sensory comfort, also loud environments, not great sensory comfort. So again, nothing particularly astonishing here, but just showing that yes, actually we are seeing that where sensory environments are is having a really significant impact on people's sensory comfort on a day-to-day basis, and that people are often in uncomfortable sensory situations. And it goes on. I won't go through this whole thing here, but you can see, you know, various things in the more blue. You know, this is the more sensory discomfort. So people, you know, definitely when there's crowds reporting high sensory discomfort, when they're exposed to repetitive annoying sounds, like somebody, you know, clicking a pen repeatedly or chewing obnoxiously or something, people were not, you know, in great sensory comfort then. Even, you know, things like indoor noises like the air conditioning were associated with a surprising level of sensory discomfort. Headaches, not great sensory comfort either. And there's other things as well that, of course, we could break down further. So people here are saying that, you know, clothing they liked, and furniture they liked, and, you know, taste sensations they liked. Presumably that's because they're choosing to wear clothing that they like, because they're choosing to eat food that they like. But what happens if people are exposed to foods that they don't like, clothing that they don't like and find uncomfortably itchy? You know, there's a lot more that one fine-grained detail that one could probe here that we just couldn't get because of sort of the coarseness of this sample of people's everyday experiences. So this is also showing that there's quite a bit more that one, you know, can and should do. For example, there's a colleague, Brittany St. John, who was you know, just finishing up a project at OTARC in Australia, that's the research center I work in, about a sensory-friendly chicken nugget. Brilliant project, and that's just one tiny chunk of that taste area that we've so coarsely put as a single row in this very long table. So there's a ton of, you know, room for research on this. So, you know, to conclude, definitely major need for change to make, you know, campuses more inclusive, making sure that we have this, you know, supportive community as part of that for those who want to access it, making sure that our supports are easy to access, because what's the point of having a support if you can't get it? And that would include, you know, greater sensory accessibility and inclusiveness, so that we can make our university spaces where, you know, autistic people can fully and equally belong.
If you consider time management as an issue that affects the students, because I have a child in college, and the main problem is like managing all the course load and the homework that never stops, and how to prioritize just the subjects that he prefers, and he does everything, and then the ones he doesn't like just doesn't do anything. So that's a major problem, and the tutoring in college where he is, just like a half an hour, 1 hour, he doesn't finish anything that fast, right? So like the time management for my child's perspective is the main problem. So have you guys considered adding that as one of the recommendations to offer some kind of coaching or tutoring in the school that's more neurodivergent friendly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And I agree. Yeah, people are coming into these environments with maybe a brain where these executive function things are harder to begin with. They don't have practice at it. And then suddenly they're expected to just, immediately grasp a skill with no preparation. And that is just not a reasonable expectation. And maybe part of it is trying to, work on developing these skills earlier before people are entering post-secondary to the extent that any given person is able to do so easily. But that is not a sufficient solution in itself, obviously, as you are finding. So I think the Aggie neurodiversity community and groups like that have their place as, those spaces for peer support and, the unmasking and the supportive community. And there are things that one can do perhaps within that, like the neurodivergent community at La Trobe, where I'm working now. That's where the OTARC Center is. They actually have this thing where they just have certain meetings where there's not actually like a social meeting. It's just so that people can work on their assignments or studying or whatever in the presence of other people collectively, and they can all sort of hold each other to account. And I feel like that's a great and brilliant thing. But it's not, sufficient to just do these things through peer support. There also needs to be that formal support. And yeah, there's a lot of things, counseling or tutoring that exist as services that are provided to the general student population, but where there's not sort of the understanding of the additional time or needs or, the different sorts of challenges that might be encountered in a neurodivergent population as to a neurotypical population. And so we need to, improve those supports in terms of the, time available, the understanding of the people working within them, to make them at a point where they are actually adequate for all populations. That is my humble opinion.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was founded in 1998 with a promise to reduce and prevent the disabilities that can be associated with autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. Every day, our clinicians and researchers make progress on that promise. Our groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other conditions associated with disability are helping affected individuals achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website or our social media platforms to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.